Christmas morning, 2011. Across California, families were unwrapping presents, laughing and recording memories. Inside one small apartment in Anaheim, two young sisters ran to the Christmas tree, excited to see what Santa had brought them. Their mother and stepfather sat quietly on the sofa, their 7-week-old baby brother cradled between them. With a small nod and a grin, William gave the girls permission to tear into their gifts. Wrapping paper flew. Excited voices filled the room, and each time they held up a toy, William smiled and told them it was amazing. But slowly, the girls' excitement faded. Each time they looked toward their mother, she didn't react. She didn't speak. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She just sat there, still, wearing sunglasses. William leaned in and whispered to them, "Mommy ruined Christmas. She got drunk and she ruined Christmas." But their mother wasn't drunk. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't ignoring them. She was dead. And William Wallace already knew it. What happened inside that Anaheim apartment in the hours leading up to Christmas morning wasn't a tragic accident, and it wasn't a moment of drunken chaos. It was the culmination of years of escalating violence, ignored warnings, and a mother desperately trying to protect her children from the man who would ultimately take her life. Tonight, we're going back to December 2011 to retrace the final hours of Za'Zell Preston, a 26-year-old mother of 3 whose hopes for a fresh start were shattered inside the place she thought she'd finally be safe. This is the story behind the Christmas morning discovery that shocked first responders, shattered a family, and left a community demanding to know how so many chances for intervention were missed. Welcome to another episode of the Thursday Brief and the first episode of our Dark December series. This is the story of Za'Zell Preston. Before that horrific Christmas morning, before the newspaper articles, before the courtroom photos and the horrific details that would shock a community, there was just Za'Zell. Za'Zell Dominique Preston, born on the 5th of September 1985 in Orange County, California, was a daughter, a sister, and a friend long before she was ever tied to William Wallace. She had this warm, easy laugh, the kind that made other people join in, even if they didn't really understand the joke. Za'Zell, or Zizi, as her friends and family affectionately called her, stood out from the very beginning. She was a talented dancer, especially drawn to ballet, the discipline, the grace, the way movement could tell a story. And when she wasn't dancing, she was creating. Za'Zell was an artist at heart, sketching, painting, and losing herself for hours in colour and expression. But before she ever had the chance to fully pursue those passions, life shifted. Still in high school, Za'Zell became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl at age 17. 5 years later, in her early 20s, she welcomed another daughter. Despite the challenges, she embraced motherhood with a fierce, protective love. Her children were her grounding force, her motivation and her joy. We don't know who the father of her children was. We don't know if the children were fathered by the same man or the result of different relationships. But what we do know is that at the time of her second daughter's birth, Za'Zell was single, and the children's father didn't appear to be in the picture at all. Za'Zell wasn't worried about her daughters missing out on male influences in their lives, though, because her large family, including 3 brothers, absolutely doted on her children, and they were never short of love. Now, just to butt in before we go any further, this story isn't quite as popular as some other Christmas tragedies, and it doesn't get as much coverage. But where there is coverage, it can sometimes be a bit sketchy or overly opinionated. And we're all entitled to our opinions, right? But in some cases, Za'Zell has been discussed in a really negative way, with people saying that she most likely didn't even know who the father of her children was. I don't think it's fair to jump to those conclusions, because we have absolutely no evidence of that. Just because we don't know who the father or fathers were, doesn't mean to say that Za'Zell didn't. And before we continue, it is important to pause and acknowledge the cultural landscape surrounding young motherhood, especially for Black women, then and now. Because while Za'Zell herself was surrounded by love, support, and community, the world she lived in wasn't always as kind to women in her position. For decades, society has pushed deeply unfair narratives about young Black mothers. Labels like irresponsible, broken homes, welfare queens, and absent fathers are thrown around all too often, and they're footed in racism, classism, and decades of political fear-mongering. These stereotypes were never accurate, but they've been repeated so often that they do unfortunately still linger in the background of public conversations today. And even now, research shows that Black single mothers and Black fathers of broken down relationships are judged far more harshly than their white counterparts, as if their family structure says anything about their worth, their character, or the love that they give their children. It doesn't. The truth is actually quite simple. Black mothers have always been among the strongest, most resourceful, most loving pillars in their communities. They raise children, hold families together, build support networks, and fight for futures that society too often tries to deny them. So when we talk about Za'Zell being a young mother, what we are not doing is reinforcing those stereotypes. Instead, we're acknowledging that she succeeded despite the narratives that were stacked against women who looked like her. Narratives she actively disproved throughout her education, her ambition, her devotion to her kids, and the love she poured into her life. Za'Zell was not a stereotype. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, a mother, and a woman with dreams. And her story deserves to be heard without society's old racist filters clouding it. And it's important that we say this clearly, because true crime should represent every community on equal terms. Black victims matter just as much as white victims. Their stories deserve the same dignity, and their memories deserve to be protected from harmful narratives that erase their humanity. Za'Zell was young, but she already carried herself with a maturity that came from wanting to give her children the best life she could. She worked hard, everything from serving at fast food restaurants to working in retail to makeup artistry. She was determined. Friends said she was one of those people who was always talking about the next step, the next job, the next goal, the next way she could build a stable future for her kids. She'd recently gone back to school, enrolling at Cypress College, trying to get qualifications that would open doors for her. She wanted something secure, something she could rely on. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Busy, hopeful, full of plans, and surrounded by a family who adored her. And it's somewhere in the middle of all of this that she met William Wallace. At first, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary, just a new relationship. Someone who showed interest, someone who stepped into her life at a time when she was juggling so much. At first, the relationship seemed like a fresh start, someone to share a life with, someone to build something steady alongside. But behind closed doors, things weren't stable at all. They hadn't been together that long when William moved into her apartment. Then slowly, subtly, he began inserting himself deeper into Za'Zell's world, into her routine, into her decisions, into her family life. The kind of shift that doesn't happen all at once, but over weeks and months. Small changes that don't look dangerous until you step back and connect the dots. What began as simply meeting someone new would eventually become the relationship that changed everything. William Wallace lived a life that, on the surface, didn't draw too much attention. Born and raised in Southern California, he grew up in an environment that could be described as inconsistent at best. His own father claimed that William really had to bring himself up and was expected to be independent. It's quite sad to hear someone's own father basically say they didn't raise their own child and expected them to raise themselves, make their own decisions, and navigate the world on their own. By the time he reached his late 20s, William appeared to be stuck in a bit of a cycle. Short-lived jobs, unreliable behaviour, and a tendency to deflect blame onto everyone but himself. He didn't build a career path or have long-term goals as Za'Zell did. Instead, he drifted between employment and periods of unemployment. He wasn't known for ambition or stability. William had a temper, one that could flare quickly, unpredictably, and often over small things. Arguments escalated easily. His responses to frustration ranged from sulking and passive aggression to explosive anger. And like many domestic abusers, people later noticed he had a deep need for control. Control over his environment, control over money, control over the people closest to him. This could be tied to the fact that he had, in effect, brought himself up and so been the primary decision maker in his own life from a young age, but in no way excuses how he conducted himself. By the time he met Za'Zell, William was nearly 30 years old, around 4 years older than she was. He was employed as a dock worker, but still struggling to maintain the consistency that family life demands. His relationship style already showed the telltale markers of volatility: possessiveness disguised as concern, jealousy framed as loyalty, arguments that shifted blame back onto the other person, and periods of calm that felt temporary, as if held together by tension rather than genuine resolution. Friends of Za'Zell would say later that they noticed a change in her a while after she began seeing William. She became quieter at times, more reserved about certain aspects of her home life, something that is tragically common in relationships marked by control or intimidation. She rarely spoke badly about him in the very early days, but she often seemed tired, overwhelmed, or anxious to keep the peace. Za'Zell was the one juggling work, studying, and raising 2 daughters, yet William often framed himself as a bit of a victim, the one being disrespected or unappreciated. The closer friends looked, the more clear it became that William lived in a cycle typical of many domestic abusers: tension, explosion, minimisation, temporary calm, over and over. In December 2011, Za'Zell's 3-year marriage to William had already been rocky for a long time. In 2008, William had actually threatened to kill Za'Zell, strangled her until she was unconscious, and had beaten her so severely that Za'Zell's mother, Za'Zell, said that her daughter was unrecognisable. Just hold that thought for a second. A mother saying how their own flesh and blood was unrecognisable. That was a brutal beating. The kind of injuries that tell you exactly who held the power and who was being terrorised inside that home. And yet, the justice system treated it as a misdemeanour. 18 days in jail. That was the consequence for beating a young mother until she was unrecognisable. 18 days. I think it's almost insulting to call that a sentence. It's more like a long weekend in jail. It's a kind of punishment that you'd really expect for a bar fight or a minor public disturbance, not for life-altering violence against a partner. And it forces us to ask some uncomfortable but necessary questions. How was that a misdemeanour? How do you look at a woman who has been attacked so viciously and fold that into the lowest category of criminal charges? What protection did that offer Za'Zell? Because it clearly didn't stop him. It didn't rehabilitate him. It didn't warn him. It didn't put distance between him and the woman he was destroying piece by piece. And what message did that send to her abuser? That he could do it again. That the system wouldn't really intervene. That violence behind closed doors just didn't matter as much as violence in the street. And the awful truth is that this wasn't unusual. For decades, including the late 2000s, domestic violence cases were routinely downplayed, undercharged, and dismissed as family issues. Police departments often lacked training. Prosecutors were overloaded. Courts leaned toward leniency under the belief that reconciliation was far more important than accountability. The result? Victims were left unprotected, unheard, and unprioritised, and offenders were given the freedom to escalate. What happened to Za'Zell in 2008 should have been a giant flashing warning sign. One that came with real consequences, real separation, and real protection. Instead, the system handed her abuser a slap on the wrist and basically sent him straight back into her life. And years later, she paid the price for that failure with her life. The relationship continued, and so did the physical assaults. William was so insanely jealous that he would beat Za'Zell if she was too long doing the grocery shopping. Her family pleaded with her to leave him, but I think we all know by now from following true crime cases, when you're with someone as violent and controlling as William, it isn't easy to just walk away. At one point, Za'Zell did everything she was supposed to. She followed the process. She reached out for help. She secured an order of protection against William, the official document meant to keep him away from her home, and her children. But a piece of paper can only protect someone if the person obeys it. And William didn't. He violated that order multiple times. Not once, not by accident, not in a moment of confusion. He was arrested and even jailed on at least 2 separate occasions, specifically for breaching the protective order. And that should tell you everything you need to know about the dynamic inside that relationship. He didn't fear consequences. He didn't respect boundaries. And he didn't stop. For Za'Zell, each violation wasn't just a legal issue. It was a message that he could show up whenever he wanted. A message that the system could temporarily detain him, but couldn't stop him from coming back. A message that she was still in danger, no matter what the paperwork said. And part of that danger comes from the way these orders function differently, depending on where you live. A US audience and a UK audience hear these terms and often assume that they're the same thing, but they aren't. In the United States, an order of protection is usually issued in domestic violence situations. It can include multiple restrictions, like no contact, no proximity, no harassment, no communication. And violating it is a criminal offence, but enforcement varies heavily by state, police department, and the workload of the courts. In the United Kingdom, the closest equivalent we have is a restraining order, or sometimes a non-molestation order in family courts. These orders function similarly. They prohibit contact, harassment, or coming near the victim, but the UK process tends to be a bit more centralised, with stronger enforcement once the order is granted. Violating a UK restraining order is also a criminal offence, but historically, both systems have faced the same issue. The order only works if authorities respond quickly and the abuser actually fears the law. The reality is, on paper, Za'Zell had protection. In practice, she had a dangerous partner who ignored court orders, ignored consequences, and pushed further every time he got away with it. And this is what makes her story so heartbreaking. She tried to protect herself. She used the system exactly as she was told to, and yet that system still failed to keep William Wallace away. And William would use his charm to manipulate Za'Zell time and again into getting back with him. He promised her he was a changed man. He told her he loved her, and that's why he got angry. It wasn't because he was a bad man. It was because he loved her so much. He didn't beat her when she spent too long grocery shopping because he was a controlling monster. He did it because he'd been scared for her safety and just wished that she'd let him know she was going to be late so he didn't go out of his mind. He lost control because he just loved her so much. He didn't threaten to kill her and strangle her when she spoke to other males because he was a jealous beast. He did it because she hadn't realised that the males she was talking to were being inappropriate. They could hurt her. He needed her to understand that she couldn't trust everyone. He was just getting her to see that. He was protecting her because he just loved her so much. He didn't push her to the ground and kick her for no reason because he was a sick pig. Why couldn't she see that she disrespected him? She just made him feel so unappreciated, and that level of hurt made him lose control because, he just loved her so much. And Za'Zell, she really did love this man, despite what he did to her, despite how he made her feel. She wanted him to change. She believed he could. And there was probably a bit of defiance mixed in. I can help him change, and you will see that this is not the man I fell for. Exacerbating all that was the fact that William had found God. During one of his stints in prison, he turned to the Lord, realised the error of his ways, began to pray, and began to live his life for the better. Za'Zell was thrilled. That was all she ever wanted for William. She trusted her faith, and she trusted that William's newfound faith would solve everything. In early 2011, Za'Zell discovered she was pregnant again, and something in her relationship with William definitely changed. He seemed to calm down, at least outwardly. The couple refocused. They planned. They celebrated. They tried to bring some peace into their home for the sake of the baby that they were expecting. In December 2011, that baby, a tiny 7-week-old boy, was now part of a lively household. 2 older daughters running through the rooms, the newborn nestled in his mother's arms, Za'Zell trying her best to hold everything together, holding on to hope that this time things might be different. But behind that hope, something darker was already building. Because William was still a man whose internal world was a mixture of resentment, frustration, and entitlement, especially towards Za'Zell. Their marriage wasn't built on partnership, faith, or emotional safety. It was built on imbalance. She was the provider, the caregiver, the student, the mother of 3. He was the unpredictable force dictating the tone of that household. And on Christmas Eve, all of that volatility finally erupted. Za'Zell and William attended a party at a neighbour's home on Christmas Eve. They were heard arguing when they returned to their apartment by another neighbour who said that raised voices could be heard in the alley outside the building. Behind the thin walls of the Anaheim apartment complex, the argument escalated. All 3 children were home at this point, absorbing the tension that had become far too common. As the shouting continued, things went very wrong. According to later statements, Za'Zell's then 8-year-old daughter described a chaotic moment. Her mother, who had been drinking, walking away from William during the argument, tripping and falling into a glass table. She told investigators that neither she nor her stepfather could catch Za'Zell in time. The fall shattered the table, cutting Za'Zell and injuring her head. Trying desperately to help, William and the young girl dragged Za'Zell into the bathroom to clean her wounds, but even that went wrong. While trying to lift her, they dropped her and she struck her head again. This time, she became unresponsive. At that point, William carried her to the bedroom and laid her in bed, telling the little girl that their mother simply needed to sleep it off. She probably had a concussion and she would be better in the morning. He insisted that everybody should get some rest so they'd be ready to open presents first thing. But the night passed and Za'Zell didn't wake up. When the children excitedly ran toward the tree the next morning, William was already panicking. He'd tried to wake Za'Zell, shaking her, calling her name, but she was cold, completely unresponsive. And instead of calling 911 immediately, William made a ridiculously bizarre and disturbing decision. He dragged Za'Zell's body from the bedroom into the living room and propped her upright on the sofa, sitting, posed, lifeless. And then he placed a pair of sunglasses over her face and tried to make the morning appear as normal as possible. But as the children opened their presents, holding them up for their mother to see, they grew increasingly frightened. She wasn't reacting. She wasn't even moving. William told them that the mother had got drunk. He told them that the mother had ruined Christmas. But William's panic eventually pushed him to call 911 at 9:30 a.m, telling the dispatcher that his wife had injured herself and wouldn't wake up. The operator instructed him to begin CPR, but in the middle of the directions, William hung up. When paramedics arrived, they found Za'Zell exactly as the children had, sitting upright on the sofa, slightly slumped to the side, sunglasses on her face, completely motionless. There was no blood on her clothing, no signs of any disturbance in the living room. William told them that she had been drunk and she'd fallen a bit earlier, hit her head, hurt herself, and that was it. He wondered if she had a concussion. But paramedics instantly knew this wasn't true. There were no fresh signs of life, no recent collapse. They began resuscitation efforts anyway, but it was already obvious. Za'Zell had been deceased long before the 911 call. Paramedics contacted the police immediately. Inside the apartment, officers found details that contradicted William's accident narrative. Spots of blood in multiple rooms, holes punched through the plaster walls, a bedroom door nearly ripped completely off its hinges, and evidence of a violent struggle, not just a fall. To them, the scene did not resemble a single tragic accident. It looked like hours of conflict, escalation, and injury. William Wallace was arrested on suspicion of homicide that very same morning. His family, stunned, argued that he couldn't be responsible. They pointed to the 8-year-old's account. She saw her mother fall into the table, so how could William be charged with Za'Zell's murder? But investigators already understood the truth. Yes, Za'Zell fell. Yes, the daughter witnessed part of it. But none of that explained the rest of the injuries. None of that explained the scene of violence throughout the rest of the home. None of that explained why Za'Zell was left untreated for hours. And none of that explained why she had been staged like a prop on Christmas morning. This wasn't the story of a simple accident. This was something else. When Za'Zell Preston's body reached the Orange County Coroner's Office, the truth of what happened on Christmas Eve began to surface in a way no staged scene, no sunglasses, and no carefully rehearsed story could hide. The injuries told their own story, and it was not the story William Wallace had been trying to sell. The most devastating findings were the severe blunt force injuries to Za'Zell's head. She had multiple skull injuries far more consistent with repeated blows or impacts than a single fall, and she had severe bleeding in and around the brain. Forensic pathologists described this as non-survivable without immediate medical intervention. These were not minor injuries somebody could sleep off. These were not injuries that she could wake up from. These were catastrophic, violent injuries. Za'Zell also suffered significant trauma to her face and neck. There was bruising along her jawline, injuries to her mouth, deep swelling consistent with forceful gripping, and a badly broken nose. Each injury suggested physical contact, multiple points of impact, not simply a fall into a glass table. Across her torso and limbs, the coroner documented bruises in various stages of healing, fresh contusions, abrasions, and marks consistent with being struck or pushed against hard surfaces. At least some bruising predated Christmas Eve, fitting with the history of domestic violence later revealed at trial. There were also injuries consistent with having been dragged, the kind of patterned abrasions that you see when skin is pulled across flooring. One of the biggest blows to William's story came from the coroner's estimate of Za'Zell's time of death. Based on body temperature, livor mortis patterns, and the condition of her tissues, the medical examiner determined that she had been dead for hours before 9:30 a.m. In fact, her estimated time of death was recorded as approximately 1 a.m, long before the children opened their presents, long before William staged her on the sofa, long before he made the call to 911. There was no medical scenario in which Za'Zell could have suffered these injuries, then carried out any activities the next morning. The autopsy alone dismantled William's accident narrative completely. This wasn't a tragic slip. It wasn't a single fall. This was a violent, sustained assault with multiple impacts inflicted over a period of time, followed by hours of inaction that might have cost Za'Zell any chance of survival. And the staging, the sunglasses, the posing, the faked Christmas morning only further reinforced that the priority had never been saving Za'Zell. The priority had been covering up what really happened. William was held on $1 million bail while detectives investigated further and the prosecution began building their case. Seidel, Za'Zell's mother, was granted immediate custody of Za'Zell's 3 children, who were immediately orphaned following William's arrest. One of Za'Zell's sisters actually contested this quite early on, and there was an eventual battle for full custody of them, but in the end, the children remained with Seidel and her second husband, Ronald. Funeral services for Za'Zell were held on Saturday, January the 7th, 2012, at Gospel Light Church of God in Christ in Santa Ana, California. Well over 100 people attended to pay their respects and celebrate Za'Zell's short life. And then the case dropped out of public consciousness. There were no updates. Everything went silent. until the 8th of March 2021, when William's trial began with prosecutors opening statements. Family and friends later gave testimony. Sally Barker, Za'Zell's grandmother, said that when Za'Zell had told her she was going to marry William, she'd begged her granddaughter to reconsider. She said she had a really bad feeling about William. Za'Zell's family described him as incredibly violent and controlling, and they said that he had threatened to kill Za'Zell on multiple occasions. Sally stated that she had once arrived at Za'Zell's apartment block to find Za'Zell lying outside on the street, curled up in a fetal position, bloodied and bruised after one of William's vicious attacks. The court heard how Za'Zell actually had to call a family member for help from a convenience store bathroom after William had assaulted her. She had fled and he had followed her, clearly wanting to finish what he started. Panic-stricken, she'd run into the store and into the bathroom to call for assistance from there, hoping she could be rescued before William tracked her down. And these were only a couple of instances given of the abuse that Za'Zell suffered prior to her death. One of Za'Zell's longtime friends, Laurie Galloway, was actually a member of the council for Anaheim City, and she also ran a shelter for abused women and children. She testified that William regularly hit, threatened, and controlled Za'Zell, and that she and other friends and family members had begged Za'Zell to leave him, but she wouldn't. Laurie stated, "This is the story of a girl who had access to resources, but thought she could handle it. These men are experts at apologising. The women think they can change them." Senior Deputy District Attorney Heather Brown described Za'Zell as a woman trapped in a cycle of escalating violence, living with a partner who routinely used threats and intimidation to keep control. According to Brown, friends, family, and even Za'Zell herself had repeatedly expressed fear that one day William Wallace would go too far. For 3 years, Brown argued, William had warned Za'Zell that he would kill her, and on Christmas Eve, she said, he finally acted on the threats that he had woven into their relationship. The testimony from Za'Zell's eldest daughter, who was a teenager by the time of the trial, became one of the most harrowing elements of the courtroom proceedings. She told the jury that the argument between her mother and William began almost as soon as they returned home from that holiday party on Christmas Eve. Voices escalated, things quickly shifted from verbal to physical, and then, in the chaos, she said she saw William shove her mother with enough force that Za'Zell fell straight into the glass coffee table. Shards exploded everywhere. The daughter recalled William immediately turning to her, a child, and ordering her to help pull pieces of broken glass out of her mother's injured body. What happened next only deepened the horror. According to the daughter, William dragged Za'Zell into the bathroom under the guise of cleaning her up, but instead of helping her, he dropped her, her head striking the edge of the toilet with such a sickening impact that the girl believed her mother may have died in that very moment. In her words, after she hit the toilet, I think she was already gone. He carried her to the bedroom like she was just sleeping, but she was cold. Despite the severe injuries, the bleeding, the fall, the impact to her skull, William did not call 911. He did not ask neighbours for help. He did not take her to a hospital, even though all 3 children were still inside the apartment, terrified and awake. Instead, prosecutors said he put Za'Zell in bed and left her there through the night. And then came Christmas morning. The 2 girls woke up before sunrise, excited to open the presents waiting under the tree. Instead of waking their mother, they found William dragging Za'Zell's lifeless body from the bedroom. He then sat her upright on the living room sofa, placed the sunglasses over her eyes, and instructed the children to start opening their gifts while he recorded them, filmed them, as though nothing had happened. It was only when the girls kept glancing at their mother's motionless body, confused and frightened that William finally picked up the phone. And even then, he didn't tell dispatchers that his wife was gravely hurt. He simply said she couldn't be woken up. Za'Zell's daughter recalled, "I remember trying to touch my mom, and she was just rock hard, cold, and I said, 'Mommy,' and she didn't respond." Another neighbour revealed how they saw William carrying a body up the building stairs to Za'Zell's apartment. As the argument on Christmas Eve night had been intensifying, Za'Zell had tried to escape, but she hadn't made it far. William caught up with her and dragged her back up the stairs. The neighbour said that he saw William at the apartment complex gate pick up what looked like a person as if you were carrying a dead body. William himself had told family and his defence team a completely different version of events. Well, a few, actually, not just one. He obviously initially told first responders that Za'Zell had tripped and fallen into the glass table and hurt her head. He alleged that she was drunk from the party and it was an accident, and he never mentioned anything about arguments at this time. After his arrest, he told relatives that he had been defending himself. He claimed Za'Zell had gone wild and attacked him, even bitten him, and she drunkenly fell on the glass coffee table. In yet another retelling, he wasn't even bothering to defend himself, but was just standing there while Za'Zell attacked him violently and then drunkenly fell onto the glass coffee table. In all these versions, he claimed that Za'Zell accidentally died after hitting her head. Wallace's attorney, Heather Moorhead, pushed back against the prosecution's version of events, and she argued that both William and Za'Zell had been drinking really heavily that night, and that Za'Zell had suffered multiple accidental falls. A fall down the stairs, a fall into a glass table, and a fall again in the bathroom. According to Moorhead, these injuries were tragic, but they weren't the result of an assault. She emphasised that the bleeding in Za'Zell's brain was so extensive and spread across multiple regions that, in her view, medical experts couldn't pinpoint which specific head injury caused it. So because of this, Moorhead claimed, there was no definitive way to prove that a deliberate act led to Za'Zell's death. Her argument was simple. If the injuries were accidental, then William couldn't be held criminally responsible. Moorhead also highlighted that the relationship, despite its turbulence, wasn't entirely defined by conflict and that actually there was a lot of love in the relationship. She said that at one point in August 2011, Za'Zell had even requested a modification to the stay away order that was in place so the two could resume contact. Something the defence used to argue that the couple still wanted to be together, and this wasn't a case of William threatening or manipulating Za'Zell into being in a relationship with him. Prosecutor Brown really hit back firmly against the defence's suggestion that Za'Zell's injuries were the result of drunken accidents. Brown told the jury that even if they believed the fall theory, William's behaviour still pointed to implied malice, because according to the medical timeline, Za'Zell likely died around 1 a.m, yet William didn't contact police or seek help until hours later. Brown also rejected the idea that William himself had been too intoxicated to fully understand what was happening. She said that there was ample evidence showing he was not drunk to the point of impairment that night. He managed to carry Za'Zell, a 114-pound woman, up an entire flight of stairs. He wasn't, she argued, too intoxicated to strike her repeatedly or to shout degrading insults at her. A neighbour also testified that they saw William pick up Za'Zell's shoes and throw them up the stairs as he brought her back to the apartment. Behaviour the prosecution suggested showed anger, not intoxication. Brown went further, telling the jury that William wasn't too drunk for a clean-up job. According to the prosecution, William changed Za'Zell's clothes in the bathroom before finally calling for help, something Brown argued only made sense if he was attempting to hide what had really happened. She also noted that around midnight, William managed to call his brother and report that Za'Zell wasn't moving. He was sober enough to find the phone, dial the number, and give that information, yet he still chose not to call 911. The prosecution then shifted to motive. Just days before the attack, while out Christmas shopping, Za'Zell had quietly told relatives that she was actually preparing to leave Wallace for good. Brown suggested that Wallace may have discovered those plans, describing him as so insecure that he would lash out even when Za'Zell spent too long at the store. In Brown's telling, that insecurity escalated into violence on Christmas Eve. Brown also addressed the inconsistent statements made by Za'Zell's young daughter in the early stages of the investigation that the defence at trial were desperately trying to undermine by calling her an unreliable and inconsistent witness. The child, only 8 years old at the time, had been living through repeated cycles of William's arrests and releases. According to the prosecution, William pressured the girl to lie to the police, leaving her terrified that she might lose her home or the caregiver that she still depended on. The shift in story, Brown argued, wasn't a sign of doubt. It was the product of fear. Why would an 8-year-old child who had been subject to this nightmare not do as she was told by the man she was scared of? Brown told the court no jail time stopped him, no protective order stopped him. And she said this to underscore William's history of ignoring boundaries meant to protect Za'Zell. Finally, she returned to the defence's central claim that Za'Zell's injuries could have come from a simple fall. Brown dismissed that outright, saying that people who witness or discover serious accidents instinctively call for emergency help. Innocent people call 911, she said. Za'Zell herself had reportedly told friends and family that William had said to her, "If you ever leave me, I'll kill you." Brown ended by telling the jury that on Christmas Eve 2011, William followed through on that threat. On the 4th of June 2021, 39-year-old William Wallace would finally be held accountable for his actions. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for the second-degree murder of his wife. 9 of those years, of course, had already been served. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer also released a statement reflecting on the wider human cost of Za'Zell's death. He said that losing a young mother after years of documented abuse was devastating enough on its own, but the trauma inflicted on her children made the tragedy almost unbearable to comprehend. Spitzer emphasised that these children didn't just live in a household where violence occurred behind closed doors. They directly witnessed much of the abuse. And then, on Christmas morning, they were forced to open their presents in the same room as their mother's lifeless body. Spitzer called it a memory no child should ever have to carry, stressing that the emotional weight of that day would follow them long after the criminal case was over. An absolutely devastating case, but one that also causes a lot of confusion. Because we have a perpetrator being held on bail, charged with murder, and he's held for 9 years before ever facing a jury. What happened to a defendant's right to a speedy trial, people ask? Was this whole process even legal, or have all of that man's rights been violated? They question. I hear it, and I get it. When people hear that William Wallace sat in jail for 9 years before ever facing a jury, it immediately raises a red flag. 9 years. That's not a backlog. That's nearly a decade of his life spent in limbo. And these people questioning the process are absolutely right to do so. In the United States, the Constitution guarantees the right to a speedy trial. So how is something like this even possible? The answer is, long delays can be legal, depending on why they happen. Now, I work in criminal justice in the UK, and that's different to procedures in the US, but there are a lot of crossovers and similarities, so I have done my research to make sure I'm getting all of the facts in there and not confusing the US with the UK processes. So let's just break it down. Speedy doesn't mean fast, it means reasonable. The Sixth Amendment guarantees that defendants won't be left waiting forever, but the law uses the word reasonable, not quick. Courts look at whether the defence requested delays, whether the prosecution needed more time for complex evidence, whether experts needed time to prepare reports, whether scheduling or administrative issues caused hold-ups, and whether the defendant objected to the delays. If the defendant or their lawyer agrees to continuances, the clock essentially pauses. And in William's case, a huge portion of the delay came from the defence side. The defence kept requesting continuances. Court records show that William's attorneys repeatedly asked for more time for additional forensic reviews, medical expert consultations, motions to suppress certain statements, new defence strategies, mitigation planning, and even changing legal counsel at one point. When a defendant or their lawyer says, "We need more time," the delay is not counted as a violation of the speedy trial right. So even though 9 years sounds outrageous, most of that time was largely charged to the defence, not the government. It was a complex domestic homicide case. It wasn't a one incident, one explanation homicide. The evidence was layered and it required multiple forensic pathologists, injury sequence analysts, biomechanics specialists, domestic violence experts, child witness interviews, a reconstruction of the timeline over hours, not minutes, and experts to evaluate the defence's claims about accidental falls. Cases with multiple medical experts can drag on for years, even before COVID. But then COVID hit. William was arrested in 2011, and his trial didn't begin until 2021. About 2 full years of that delay were directly tied to the pandemic. California courts shut down, jury trials were paused, backlogs exploded, and cases involving in-custody defendants were prioritised, but even those had lengthy waits. So COVID itself didn't create the delay, but it did add to an already long timeline. And William himself did not demand a speedy trial. And this is important. If a defendant wants to enforce their speedy trial right, they must file a motion, formally object to delays, and decline continuances. Wallace never did. Why? Because in many homicide cases, the defence benefits from delay. Evidence gets older, witnesses' memories fade, children grow up and become less reliable on the stand, and the defence gets more time to poke holes in the forensic timeline. So the delay wasn't something done to Wallace. It was something that strategically worked in his favour, at least in theory. Delay doesn't always mean neglect. It can mean strategy. This timeline does look bizarre to some people from the outside, but legally, if the defence agrees to the delay, it's not a violation. If the defence requests a delay, it's not a violation. If both sides need expert testimony, it's not a violation. And if the court system is overwhelmed, it's not a violation. That's how a case can sit for 9 years before a jury even hears opening statements. Supporters of William who believe that his rights were violated may see this and accept the fact that he won't be released any sooner because of a mistrial or other judicial loophole. He was allowed to sit in jail for 9 years pre-trial because he and his defence team wanted to extend the process. Going back to Za'Zell, something else that I've seen written quite frequently is, why did she not just leave him? She knew what he was like. She had the opportunity to get away when he was in prison and she kept going back. Why didn't she try and help herself and her kids? She must have been a bit of a pushover. She must have been quiet and he preyed on the fact that she looked like a victim. And that's a really upsetting part. Firstly, I always try and find out as much about the victim of the crimes I cover as possible. And I don't just mean what happened to them in terms of the deaths, but who they were in life, who they were before tragedy struck. I found that Za'Zell's Facebook page is still surprisingly viewable. And I can tell you, as an outsider, Za'Zell did not appear to be quiet, look or act like a victim, whatever that's meant to be in this case, or any case, anyway, and would absolutely not take crap off anyone. Her status updates and posts show this. She could most certainly hold her own in an argument or stand up for herself. She was not a pushover. She was fierce, and she still became a domestic abuse victim. The transformation from a fiercely independent woman into someone controlled, bullied, and beaten, it breaks your heart. And it's testament to the insidious power of psychological and emotional abuse. Strong women, intelligent women, mothers, professionals, none are immune. Abuse doesn't pick victims based on weakness. It preys on love, trust, hope, and human empathy. Domestic violence can happen to anyone, and strength alone isn't always enough to prevent a predator from gaining control. Understanding this helps us challenge stereotypes and ensures that the conversation about abuse reflects the reality that it's about power, control, and manipulation, and not the character of the victim. Za'Zell did everything she could to protect herself and her children. Her course at college, it was in domestic abuse counselling. Za'Zell was taking that course not only to help herself and her children, but to help others once she had escaped her own situation. It's just so beyond sad. So why didn't she just leave? Well, I think we all know by now that the answer is really complicated, and it lies deep in the dynamics of domestic abuse, trauma, and hope. Za'Zell had access to resources many survivors never do. She had a supportive family, friends she could turn to, and connections to women's shelters. She was enrolled in domestic violence course at college, and yet she chose to stay, believing she could handle it and that she could manage the danger herself. This is just a classic example of what psychologists call trauma bonding. Trauma bonding occurs when a victim develops a psychological attachment to their abuser despite the abuse, and it's fueled by a cycle of violence and intermittent positive reinforcement. Those moments of love, of apologies, promises of change, or even just small gestures that remind the victim of hope. For Za'Zell, every time William was released or promised he'd changed, she believed in the possibility of a safer, happier life. She believed in the man that she married, not just the man who hurt her. Being aware of resources or having supportive people around doesn't magically remove the psychological bond an abuser has on someone. Trauma, fear, and manipulation really do overpower logic. Her decision to take the domestic violence course and even consider counselling others might seem like a contradiction to some. Why would someone with so much knowledge and access to help stay in that dangerous situation? But for many survivors, learning about abuse doesn't immediately make the situation any safer. Awareness doesn't erase fear, emotional attachment, or the cycle of manipulation. Often survivors stay because leaving feels riskier than staying, even with every resource available. It's important to remember Za'Zell's choices were not about weakness or stupidity. They were about survival within a system where abusers often have more control, more power, and more manipulation than outsiders ever realise. She was trying to protect herself and her children, manage the chaos, and keep hope alive, even when the odds were stacked against her. Another important aspect of domestic abuse is that the most dangerous time for a survivor is often when they're planning to leave, or actually trying to leave their abuser. Studies show that abusers are most likely to escalate violence when they feel their control's slipping. It's a terrifying reality that many people outside the situation still don't fully understand. Many survivors don't manage to escape at the first try. On average, people in abusive relationships will make around 7 attempts before they successfully leave for good. One long-sighted study found that in 45% of homicides where a man killed a woman partner or ex-partner, a major precipitating factor was that the woman was attempting to leave or had recently separated from him. For victims who tried to leave but remained in contact or returned, the risk of severe violence remained high. Among women who left or tried to leave but stayed vulnerable, 69% experienced subsequent life-threatening incidents, compared with 44% among women who had not tried to leave at all. So we all have to remember that sometimes it's more dangerous attempting to leave than it is to stay, and that doesn't make the victim weak. Za'Zell's children, 2 young daughters and a 7-week-old baby, were at the very centre of this tragedy. Children who witness domestic violence or who lose a parent to murder are affected in profound and long-lasting ways. In Za'Zell's case, the trauma was compounded by the fact that this horrific event occurred on Christmas Day. Christmas is traditionally associated with joy, warmth, and family. For the Preston children, however, Christmas 2011 would become a memory of fear and confusion. The holiday became inextricably linked with the violence and loss inflicted by William Wallace. And this is not just a traumatic memory. It's a pivotal moment that can shape how children understand family, trust, and safety for the rest of their lives. Research shows that children who experience or witness domestic violence are at higher risk for anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and difficulties forming healthy relationships. Even when surrounded by supportive family members, the psychological imprint of such an event is profound. In Za'Zell's children, the juxtaposition of the traditional symbols of Christmas, gifts, decorations, and festive joy and fun, with the horror of their mother's death, creates a lifelong emotional scar. This case highlights the cruel reality that domestic violence doesn't just affect the victim, it reverberates through the lives of children, altering their understanding of safety, love, and family, and forever changing the way they experience moments that should bring happiness. But Za'Zell Preston herself, she was more than the tragedy that ended her life. She was vibrant, she was strong, and she was fiercely loving. A mother who fought to protect her children. A woman with dreams and talents that were never fully realised. A woman who always hoped for the best and believed in her heart that she could help others. Her story reminds us that domestic violence doesn't discriminate, and it can happen to anyone at any time, even someone as strong as Za'Zell. For her children, Christmas has become a day forever marked by loss and trauma, a painful reminder of the danger that lurked in their very own home. But for us watching, Za'Zell's story is a chance to reflect on the strength of those who endure, on the warning signs we should never ignore, and on the importance of protecting those who can't protect themselves. As the festive season approaches, let's remember those who are less fortunate, those who face fear instead of joy, and silence instead of comfort. And if you or anyone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, know this: help is available. You are not alone. The numbers are on the screen, linked in the description, and if all you need is to talk, this community is here for you. I'd love to hear from you folks in the comments. What stood out to you in Za'Zell's story? What message do you think families should hear about protecting loved ones during the holidays? Your thoughts and voices matter, and your comments help to build awareness and community, so please do get involved in discussing this case. If Za'Zell's story moved you in any way, shape or form, please take a moment to share this video, to raise awareness, and to honour the lives of those affected by domestic violence. Because remembering, educating, and supporting each other is how we turn heartbreak into action. This Christmas, let's give more than presents. Let's give attention, protection, and care to those who need it most. For Za'Zell, for her children, for all of us. I'll see you all in the next one, but in the meantime, stay curious, stay kind, and take care of yourselves. I've been Fiona, and this has been Case Continued.